Yes.
So we're here today with Duarte Pedreira. He is a good friend of mine. I've known him for about 5 years now.
Correct.
He stuck out in my mind a long time ago when I was working at the bar at Harlequin Stadium when AIG sponsored the Rugby World Cup.
Can you imagine a more interesting way of meeting someone?
Exactly. So I was working there and I really wanted to learn more about sort of the world of trade, perhaps not the world of trade finance, but the world of business and finance in general. And Duarte came up to me. He came up to me because I was working at the bar, not for any other interest. And I kept talking to him, and then he just gave me his card. He goes, "Take my card. I like your style." So from then, we hit it off, and we're here today, 5 years later.
That's a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Duarte's got a very impressive list of accolades when I sent him out the questionnaire. And he's got a lot of things to talk about today, but we'll go through some of them. He is firstly a board member of ITFA. For those of you who don't know, it's the International Trade and Full Faith Association.
Although I tend to call it the International Trade Finance Association, for which some people try to kill me.
The full faithing
it's very contentious, very contentious.
The full faithing guys don't like that. He's also head of emerging markets, coverage and trade finance at Crown Agents. We're actually here today. He's very kindly booked this room for us. He's the head honcho here for trade finance. He's also a member of the International Advisory Board of Channel Capital.
Yes.
Where I got your headshot from, actually. And he's also the chairman of Shelter Them, a Rwandan charity working on poverty alleviation and empowering the youth and the general population of Rwanda, hopefully in the future, Africa in general, being a world leader in that aspect.
I hope so.
Very
It's a big part of what I do. It's what really drives me as an individual, and it's what lights up my smile on a day-to-day basis.
So how do you find time for it? You've got a lot of things going on
many people ask me that, so it's a great point to start. I mean, I was always an organized fella by definition. I normally say that I've got a little bit of OCD. But I started living life with a mantra that many people who know me are already sick and tired of hearing, which is prioritize and plan and execute. So this is very simple. Just list everything that is going on in your life. Make sure that you're as comprehensive as possible. And then start assigning priorities. And once you're done, but don't fool yourself. Assign the real priorities. So if all of a sudden you feel like staying at home and having a sleep, that's going to be your number one priority, not doing work. Because guess what? In the end, you'll be staying at home and having a sleep rather than doing the work. So if you make yourself wrong for not doing the work, then it's just a fruitless exercise. So long story short, you then start allocating the tasks in accordance with the priorities. So say that number one, spending time with my daughter and my girlfriend. So that will be straight up the priority list. Then work this, work that, the different things that you've mentioned, and eventually when I exhaust the schedule, I stop, and whatever didn't get allocated will always get allocated the following week or whenever there is time. The important thing is to live life according to your priorities, because otherwise you'll always be saying, I've got this dream, or I want to do this, but I'll do it tomorrow.
That's right.
And eventually you're just fooling yourself. So that the big exercise there is just live your life under your own rules, and if you do the planning accordingly, and if you execute accordingly, then you'll live a life that you love.
That's right.
Another very important thing in that exercise, is, given that you've asked me how do I juggle all the balls, is that eventually if you plan for something, but your execution doesn't really happen, don't go, I'll start my diet tomorrow type of thought process. The important thing is you just reassign or replan and re-execute. And again, don't make yourself wrong for saying, I didn't do this, so it's the end of the world.
That's right. I think that's why we click so much, because it's the same mentality.
Yeah.
I sometimes speak at my old, once I spoke at my old sixth form, high school, I guess you'd call it. And this is a practice I use myself, and I give it to my friends and my colleagues, whoever I feel would benefit from it. So I have a thing where I have an A4 piece of paper, and I divide it into 4 different quadrants. And then on the top left, it says professional, so personal. Then next to that, family. Underneath that, social. And to the left of that, professional.
Yes.
And in each of these 4 categories, I list what I would love my life to look like if I cared for myself enough to make it happen. So even in the personal, It could be learning new languages.
Yes.
It could be working out. It could be mastering a certain field, having more confidence in yourself. Anything that you feel personally you need to achieve as an individual. Next, I have family. So what if you could choose your life, which most people can't, but they sometimes leave it to fate or they think it's out of their hands. In what you can control, what would you put in that box?
Yes.
How would you like to have that established? Would you like to be connected with your external family, not your external, your non-immediate family? Would you like to? Where would you like to live? How many kids would you like to have if you're at the beginning of your journey?
Exactly.
What kinds of morals would you like your kids to grow up with? What kinds of places would you like to visit as a family? You know, that kind of thing. And then the social, it'd be when you're not working, who would you like to spend your time with?
Yes.
What kind of influences do you want to have in your life?
Well, that's interesting. It's interesting you say that because you said when you're not working. You know what? I've learned a lot throughout the years, and the more the years go by, and I still prefer that vision where I consider myself young, although I'm the years are punishing me. But as the years go by, the thing that is most important to me has become that social side, interestingly. So when I started my career, it was all about career, who I would become, how much money would I make, and so on and so forth. Look, I've done well for myself, and I'm very, very happy with that from a personal point of view. Just in terms of my own ambition, where I am in terms of my career and so on and so forth. But it's not that. It's just realizing that life is so much about interacting with other people. So if you look at my job now, is a lot more about coaching. It's a lot more about managing teams. Again, interacting with people, making sure. So another mantra for me in life is making sure that I leave a positive impact in others through my actions.
That's very true.
And when you can put that into your work, just makes your life so much easier. If you look at everything I do, so Crown Agents Bank, I manage a couple of teams, and eventually it's that personal interaction, making sure. I normally say to the guys and girls that my job is to make sure that they have everything, not only from an infrastructure point of view, but also from a mental well-being point of view, that they have everything they need to succeed. Same for the ITFA. I'm privileged to lead the Emerging Leaders Initiative, which is really, what does it mean? It means that I've got a responsibility to, together with a great group of other people, making sure that the industry is sustainable and that the newer generations are well equipped and prepared to develop their careers in trade finance. And more than that, they're enthusiastic about developing those careers. Again, same goes for Shelter Them. I mean, what I do at Shelter Them is to help a bunch of incredible individuals, both in Rwanda and throughout the rest of the world, making sure that about 170 children that are covered by our programs in Rwanda are equipped to having a choice over their future. So that is a critical word, particularly in the Shelter Them environment. What we do is not about aid, is not about subsidizing, is none of that. What we do is to create the conditions and the possibilities for people, for the children, eventually coming to a point in their lives where they can have a choice, and they can say, I either want to go left or right. It doesn't matter if it's the right choice, if they end up making the right choice or not, but it's about having that choice.
Giving them the ability to have a choice.
That's it. And when you live a life of poverty, one of the things that you very easily find out is that choice is not really there. So that's why our first task is to eliminate that poverty as much as we can, or mitigate it as much as we can, and then eventually educate. So as you can see, the common thread throughout my life is that interaction with people. So I said, work is an important part of your life, but the social side, at least the way I see it, trumps everything else, and that's really responsibility. That's it, and that's really what makes me smile. It makes me smile at my workplace or my different workplaces. It makes me smile with my children in Rwanda, and above all, it makes me smile at home with my loved ones.
That's a very healthy way to look at the world. I think you find, especially maybe the younger generation now, if it's perhaps the same I don't like to say your time as if you're 102 years old.
I am.
But probably in work terms, you probably worked 102 years. You're right there. But there's a sense perhaps that people are a lot more anxious now to fit where they need to fit, quote unquote fit. But there's so much more to life. That if you just open your horizons and expand what you feel success is, you can really achieve a lot more than what you first stepped out to be.
And that worries me a lot, Klisman, because eventually, again, it's going back to prioritize, plan, execute. If you force your priority just to be, looking at technical work or whatever you may do and work. I remember those guys I started investment banking myself or capital markets trading. Believe it or not, so it was an interesting story. Me and my screens, and then I got fed up of them.
That sounds like a book. Me and my screens.
Yeah, me and my screens, and eventually opening up to a much better life on the social side. But to be honest with you, working 24/7 is unhealthy. I remember when I did that. When I had the honor and the privilege to be one of the founders of Stanabank in Angola. And there weren't many of us who were equipped enough to run that place. We started about 30 individuals, I guess, of those about 10 doing all the work, and then we grew to about 400, and it was still the same 10 doing all the work. And I was working non-stop. I was working 16, 17 hours a day. And that's not healthy, right? So eventually the lifestyle drove me into being a complete robot. Nowadays, what I do merit and what I do feel is that quality time. If you have good quality time, I'm not a big believer in sleeping a lot. The other people in my life who are close to me disagree with me. They think that sleeping is a lot more important than I make it. But for me, if I sleep 5, 6, 7 hours, say, a night is absolutely fantastic, and provided that I make the most out of my time. At the end of the day, it's how happy you are. Right. And if you wake up in the morning and you have a smile and you say, okay, let's do it, then to me, you're achieving your dreams. You're living in the present and, making it count. It's not a fairy tale every day, of course.
For sure. Life has its ups and downs always.
Of course.
You need to be able to be prepared for that. That comes with life experience and allowing yourself to go through the motions.
100%.
So then how does trade finance link into this? Because you worked as a trader, then you got into trade finance, and then you found a whole different world in that. Even though as a student, perhaps for any students listening to this, or even beginners in trade finance as analysts, everyone with the suit seems as if they have the same kind of job.
Yes.
But once you jump into that suit world, you see that's so complex, it's so diverse.
Yes, it is.
And you come into the world of trade finance.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about your journey?
Sure.
And then the second half of that is some of the problems, i.e. the big gap in financing.
Those are two big topics. Particularly the second one. I guess my career, I'm very passionate about the opportunities I've had, and I normally say that I was at the right place at the right time. And I'm very grateful for all the opportunities. So I talk about it passionately. But in terms of the trade finance gap, as you mentioned, or the deficit in supply of trade versus the existing demand.
1.5 trillion.
It's huge.
That's the gap.
It is huge. So that's where each and every one of us as trade financiers really have the obligation to do a little bit better. And I guess one thing for me is linked to the other. Because if we look at the way I was educated in the industry, it kind of links to the solutions that I personally have for that trade finance gap. So let's look at the first part of your question. Okay. So I did start as a hedge fund trader, which was a dream come true back then. I guess everything was going well until I realized that I was extremely risk averse, and that my hand would shake every time I
put a trade on.
I put a trade on. So eventually, that relationship between me and
the screens,
6, 8 screens or whatever it was, didn't work so well. I remember one day, that's when I realized, okay, that's it. I'm really not cut for this. I remember one day that I had a fairly decent week, and eventually I decided to take a call. It was Friday, and all the traders had agreed to go to the pub. And I remember the US market had just kicked off, and there was some sort of number coming out, but the market had settled now after the number, and all the guys. This was 2004, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. So all the traders were already kind of getting ready to go to the pub. Some of them had made their day already, so they were gone.
Was this in Angola? Or was this in
no? This was here. This was in the city. Yeah. Okay. And eventually, I was happy because I'd made a little bit of money for the week, so I thought, okay, I'm gonna deserve this beer. And my grandmother called, and I thought, okay, it's an okay week, so I'll just take the call and put a position on at the same time, which was a little bit arrogant of me, I think. And guess what happens? The position capsized completely. It was a complete car crash. I ended up losing quite a bit of money.
Do you remember what the trade was?
I can't. No, wait a second. It was foreign exchange. I think it was something like the euro dollar or whatever that went against me, which back then it tended to be a fairly volatile market, with a thin book and so on and so forth, because we were trading on the exchange, on the futures exchange. But that was probably the penny dropping moment where I had to realize, well, I'm not cut for this. When I came out of the position, I said, nah. From there, I had, again, coincidence, an amazing opportunity. I was talking about being the right place at the right time. Clearly one of those moments. I was still with the hedge fund. And I remember, as you are a hedge fund trader, it's a little bit like the fintech guys nowadays. You go to the office on your running shoes and your jeans and T-shirt and so on. And all of a sudden I get a call from a headhunter saying, oh, there's a Portuguese bank in town. We saw your CV, and they're building a representative office. So they want to hire an assistant rep. Okay. Could you come to an interview? And I said, yeah, definitely. I'd be delighted to attend. When is it? It's this afternoon. So eventually, I turn up.
To call in sick, perhaps for the last.
No. It wasn't so much of that, because remember, sort of trading environment is quite liberal, so I could just disappear if you like. But the problem was the way I was dressed. Portuguese bankers tend to be fairly conservative. Okay. And the head of international was the guy who was in town. And then I realized that the other person, the senior representative, was a very, very, very polished English gentleman, Eton educated, who's still a dear, dear friend of mine, and to whom I owe a lot in my career. But that moment, I entered the room. I was going to be interviewed by these two rather stern, experienced individuals, dressed in their best suits, and there I was in my running shoes. But interestingly, so this gentleman's name is Tom Hoffman. He's an absolute brilliant banker and an incredible person. And he didn't judge the book by its cover, so we clicked straight away, and we had quite a few good years together. Later down the line, he was even chair of an advisory company that I ran for a while, and we're very, very close. Very good. But going back in time, eventually I joined that Portuguese bank, and initially I was doing a bit of capital markets research and sales. But then I had the opportunity to go into the wonderful world of trade finance. And I'll never forget the conversation, because it was the vice chair of this Portuguese bank. He came to London and he said, look, the representative office is a great thing to have, but we really want to take the next step, and we want to open a full branch. And we want the branch to specialize in this thing called trade finance and forfeiting. Do you know what it is? Interestingly, at university, I had a really bad experience with trade finance because it was squeezed into one of my lecturer's programs. I think it was a course on money markets and foreign exchange. And the lecturer said, "Oh, I'm supposed to talk to you about trade finance, but I'm just going to skip over it because none of you will end up working."
No one's going to care enough to work in that field.
It's just a terrible field. It's full of documentation. It doesn't happen in the city of London. It happens somewhere like Slough or something like that, which I thought was fairly unfair. And eventually it's just plain boring. Yeah. So I had that initial contact with trade finance that didn't leave a very good taste. And when this chap comes from Portugal and says, "Oh, I've got news for you. You're going to be integrated in this trade finance team," I nearly collapsed. And second move was calling all my headhunter friends to see if they could find me a role in equity sales or something like that. Which eventually didn't happen, which was great because the best thing that's ever happened to me was eventually I started working with a team of very, very experienced trade financiers. Still very dear friends of mine, Teresa Casal, Josephine Grima, Chris Hines, and of course my very, very own mentor, which is now naming the ITFA mentoring program, which is now a global program. His name was Martin Ashurst. Himself represented the trade finance industry perfectly. He was the perfect trade financier, a gentleman with a tremendous sense of humor, but above everything else, his word was always his bond, and he taught me a lot. So eventually learning from those people, I started having more and more responsibility. I started my career in back office, in operations, which if you imagine someone who up until a year before had been a hedge fund trader going into an operation.
Very slow, very different dynamics.
Very
change
different.
Of pace.
So eventually finding myself burying my head in loan documentations and promissory notes and bills of exchange and letters of credit was a difficult exercise. But nowadays, if I have to look back and pinpoint one moment that really defined my career, was probably that. Because I had all of a sudden, not an in-depth understanding because I didn't stay too long in operations. I stayed about 9 months to a year. But eventually it was, it was very, very important for me. And nowadays when I hire in the front office function for trade finance professionals, I always ask the question of whether the individual has worked previously in operations or not, because it does make a difference. The difference is between actually understanding your product in depth or not. So eventually after that, after learning from the likes of Joe Grima and Chris Hines, I moved into the front office role, starting... We did a little bit of everything. It was very interesting because it was more or less a typical forfeiting desk back then. We would originate, we would trade, we would distribute. And my first task was actually to distribute, especially large transactions. So I was given a list of names by Teresa Casal, and she said, "Look, all these people know me. Call them and introduce yourself, and talk about the assets we have for sale." And that was a bit of a daunting task. All of a sudden, I had to call all these people around the world who had never heard my name. They had no idea who I was. And all of a sudden, I'm supposed to sell them millions of dollars in trade finance facilities. Which I was still learning myself. Fast forward a few months, and again, it was a brilliant exercise for me. So again, I was so lucky to have these people as my mentors.
Your mentors and your leaders in this
very
game.
much so.
I think it's important to have people that have been in the game who can sort of teach you the ropes.
Yes.
So you progress a lot faster, but it's not about the speed, it's about the knowledge you gain from these people.
Yes.
You can make a mistake yourself, but you can learn from a mistake and avoid it completely.
I remember my first trade in trade finance terms. I was very, very happy because I'd sold a $1 million trade participation on an Azerbaijani bank to a fund in Canada. And to me, it was about completing the trade. I was beyond belief happy. It's one of those moments where you'll always remember who you sold it to, what you sold, all the details of the transaction. And I went to my boss, and Teresa said, okay, congratulations on the sale, but that sale is really rubbish. And I said, why? And then she explained to me, and she really, really turned the page. She said, look, you now have to replace this asset. So the asset was yielding X percent. I'd sold it for Y percent. But it wasn't so much about the profit margin. It was about how we're going to get another asset that is going to yield as much as this one, regardless of how much we've made up front in terms of a profit margin. So that was a huge lesson for me. For which I'm of course very grateful. That day it was a little bit bittersweet, as they say, because I did my first sale, but then I realized I could have done better. But it's this sort of lessons that really kept me going throughout my career. And as I progressed, then eventually we had a little bit of a catastrophe in international financial markets. Many people think of it as being Lehman Brothers. I tend to think of it as Lehman or trade finance markets, very own Lehman Brothers, which was a bit of a debacle in Kazakhstan. So everybody who had trade finance lines back then was piling up into Kazakhstan, into a couple of banks in Kazakhstan, without asking any questions. It was, if you want to define herd mentality, that was it, 100%. And eventually we had a bit of that ourselves at this Portuguese bank I was working for. And then the whole thing just collapsed. So of course, for the desk to be caught with potential losses in the tens of millions, it was quite disruptive. The Portuguese bank still asked me to carry on, although they were going to disband the trade finance and forfeiting desk. So they gave me a vote of confidence, given that I'd founded the bank here in London. But after you take out trade finance and forfeiting, there's not a lot for a small Portuguese bank to do in this financial center. So then eventually I had what I consider the big break in my career, which was a telephone call from a friend who was also working in the past for that Portuguese bank, although in their Brazilian subsidiary. And he said, look, I'm now running a bank in Angola, a startup bank in Angola. Would you care to come and help and run trade finance and transactional banking? So I did. Completely different set of clients, completely different set of instruments and tasks. I had to learn a lot by myself. But again, I had some superstars in the industry who helped me a lot. Thinking of Anne-Marie Woolley, who headed up trade and commodity finance for Standard Bank. My dearest friends, Kenton Hartwell, Gwen Mwaba. Gwen is currently head of trade finance for Frexim Bank, and Kenton worked here with me at Crown Agents Bank. The roles reversed. I was originally his junior at Standard Bank, and then he came and very kindly agreed to work with me at Crown Agents Bank, but is now general manager of Africa Merchant Capital. So they taught me a lot about this new reality, which was a lot more structured trade and commodity finance. I loved it, and I decided to head on to Angola. Believe it or not, I'd never set foot in Angola before the day I arrived to work there. I arrived on a Friday, I think, and I started working on a Monday. And then I had the most hectic couple of years of my life. Again, I mentioned this, but sleeping patterns all off, working too much. So my work day would start at about 6 p.m., just for you to have an idea.
It would start at 6 p.m.
Start at 6 p.m.
What do you mean? Oh, so the day before you
No. So my day between, say, 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. would be about going around, meeting people, helping my team. I had quite a large team, just solving problems, right? And then at about 6 p.m., I would come back to my desk and look at my inbox and see 250 unread emails, right? Invariably, I would then go on to the garage and get my car at about 11:30 midnight. And then the next day, it would all start again at about 7.
Yeah. So how long was that for? How long did you keep up that routine?
I managed to do that for a couple of years.
Okay.
But for back then, my wife, she struggled a lot because she was working in the center of town for a large audit firm, one of the big 4.
What, in London?
No, in Rwanda.
Oh, Rwanda.
And eventually traffic was absolutely horrendous. So she would have to leave the house invariably at about 5. And she would come back also at about 9. So I would barely see her. Yeah. So it was
hectic times.
Hectic times. On the social side, it was unbelievable. Angola is an unbelievable place to live. We were very fortunate of where we ended up living. We had an incredible neighborhood, very local.
Very good.
We lived on the beach, literally. So you'd open the back garden door and you'd go to the beach. Then from there, I announced I was departing Angola, and Standard Bank. My original program was actually, plan was to go to Asia. We wanted to work in Singapore for a while, but Standard Bank asked me to stay, and I was very honored with the invitation. They've asked me to go to headquarters actually in South Africa to lead transactional banking, trade finance sales for the African continent. I didn't stay there for too long, for the main reason for that being that my wife back then couldn't find, or it would be very difficult for her to get a work permit. So I decided to come back to London. The idea was that I would still commute for Standard Bank between London and Johannesburg, but then of course ICBC took over the London office, and that made it a bit impossible. So I came back to London. I set up an advisory company, still focused on trade. It was an incredible experience because it was the first time I started something as an entrepreneur. I'd started things before, but within existing structures. Starting Caspian Sea Capital as an entrepreneur was quite a challenge. I did it with a dear friend of mine called Ricardo Cruz, and with Tom Hoffman, who agreed to be our chair. And in a very short period of time, we built ourselves an incredible network of partners across many jurisdictions. I'm thinking Turkey, I'm thinking Azerbaijan, I'm thinking Georgia, Angola, Mozambique. Emerging markets.
Frontier markets.
Definitely. So that is another common thread or trend in my career, is emerging and frontier markets.
More exciting markets, you could say.
Very exciting markets. Things that really make me tick. And eventually Caspian Sea Capital would do all the legwork that I would do as a banker in terms of structuring deals, and then placing those deals with banks or liquidity providers, as we called them back then. Then there was a bit of an important event that transformed my life. So the birth of my little daughter, and she was quite a few years in the making. So I thought, again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, your priorities and really having family at the center of things. I thought, what the heck? I don't want to miss the first few years of her upbringing. So it was between being Skype and FaceTime daddy, living on and off airplanes, or being there. So I decided, okay, Caspian Sea Capital has been a very, very interesting step in my career, but I decided to move on.
So how old were you when you had your daughter?
I was, good question, sorry, 34. 34. Yes. Which was just the perfect time. And then eventually I was invited by AIG. I wanted a bit of a change, to be honest. So I had done banking, plain vanilla structure, the FIs, corporates. Then I capitalized on that by having my own trade finance advisory company. And I wanted to do something different. So AIG still has a great team, but back then it was an absolutely stellar team, led by Neil Ross and Will Clark, two of the best people I've ever worked with, to be honest with you, who really took the time to teach me what credit insurance underwriting was all about. And I had a great time there, absolutely great time. And again, it fulfilled the purpose. I was able to be with my daughter for the first few years of her life, and still, of course, but instead of being on and off an airplane. Then, and now we're coming to the end of the story. Eventually, when I thought
that's when we met when you were
yes,
at AIG. Yeah.
Yes. So we met when I was at AIG. AIG. So Paula, my wife back then, she also worked for AIG, and we were asked by AIG to very kind of them to attend the Rugby World Cup final. With the hospitality and all of that, and that's precisely
I
when
hope
we
I
met.
provided you guys good service when I was there.
Very good service, and here we are today.
Here we are today.
That speaks for it. But after, so during my AIG days, I had this interesting pact with a headhunter that is a good friend of mine as well, and I told him, look, as I moved to AIG, I really want to be off the market for a while. And he said, no, I absolutely understand. So I'll call you first to go out for a few beers or a dinner or whatever, but I won't call you with opportunities. I said, okay, that's fair game. One day he called me, and me, naive, I picked it up. I thought, he wants to go out for a beer. And he said, do you remember when I said that I wouldn't call you with opportunities? I said, yes, very well. He goes, look, I really tried to stick to my promise, but there's something brewing that I think you need to know. And he was Helios Partners, the now shareholder of Crown Agents Bank, looking for someone to head up trade finance for Crown Agents Bank. This was about a year in the making, conversations on and off. Then I eventually joined Crown Agents Bank in August 2016. It's been a really, really, really interesting ride. This is an absolutely amazing place to work. I mean, for you to understand the dynamics here, you'd have to picture a fintech mixed with a banking license and a huge component of corporate and social responsibility. So what we do in essence, which is a strange thing for the head of trade finance to say, because trade finance here is really a byproduct of what we do. The main thing we do here is we make sure that people, mostly in OECD markets, who need to buy and deliver what we call exotic currencies, so currencies from frontier and emerging markets, that they do so. And they use us as a one-stop shop, technologically driven, to get, say, for example, imagine that you're the treasurer of a large charity sitting in Washington, and you want to disburse $1 million worth into your project in Rwanda, using a country that is very close to my heart, as you know. You just eventually come to Crown Agents Bank, buy the Rwandan francs, and eventually we will get them delivered, be it through bank to bank or SWIFT, ACH, or more excitingly, mobile wallet delivery. So we recently acquired an amazing payments provider called Segovia, and Segovia allows us to get that last mile delivery. We're still, of course, fine tuning, but I believe we're really getting there. But for us, it's great because, and for our shareholders as well, I would imagine, because all of a sudden you're talking about an institution with over 200 years of existence, but really being valued as a fintech, very capital light and very efficient, with a great social story behind it. Can you imagine getting money down to the refugee camps in the DRC, for example? It really makes a difference.
They go where others perhaps don't go because they're less risk averse to the ups and downs of.
Exactly, and it's also technology driven. So Klisman, if you go into anywhere in East Africa, to be honest, but again, Rwanda, which is my second home, and you want to pay for a ride in a motorcycle taxi, you don't just cash it in, right? So you and your taxi driver will exchange a few codes, and that's you're using your mobile money to pay someone. So when we're sitting in OECD countries and we think that we're so advanced from a banking point of view, I mean, I really invite you to go down to Africa and see how things are done. Again, from an infrastructure point of view, everything is kind of virgin and mobile driven, which is quite good. And you'd be surprised. I mean, from a technological point of view, these guys really bat the ball out of the park. Just still in terms of the career, and just to round it off, again, being at the right place at the right time. Back in 2000 and when was it? 2015, 16, if I'm not mistaken. I decided together with the back then ITFA board to launch the Martin Ashurst Global Trade Finance Mentoring Scheme, which became a huge success. And on the back of that work, I was invited by the board to put my name forward for election as well. I was elected, which was a dream come true. I was elected to the board of the ITFA in September 2017. I'm up for re-election this year in Singapore. I was elected in Edinburgh. Excuse me. And since then, I've been leading the Emerging Leaders Initiative, which is, like I said at the beginning, Emerging Leaders Initiative, it's all about creating opportunities for people who are keen in learning and finding out more about trade finance, how they can develop their careers in trade finance. So what's it made of? Well, quite a few things. One of the things I'm proudest of is our educational work, which spans across universities, for example. We're very proud to be the lecturers of the trade finance module within the master courses at CAS Business School.
Oh, very good.
We do that.
Do you sometimes teach there as well?
I teach there, yeah.
Oh,
So I lead the program.
So you're a lecturer as well. That
Yes.
should have been part of your academic. You should have told me.
I am a lecturer.
Yeah.
I've lectured in a whole bunch of different places, and so I've lectured at my former business school in Lisbon. I've lectured for CUNEF Madrid, but when they were visiting London. I've lectured in Munich. The next one will be in Madrid. We're going there on the 23rd of April, if I'm not mistaken, Instituto de Empresa. And again, we do that. We do that all the time. We're now in conversations with London Metropolitan, Queen Mary. So these things will happen very soon.
Very good.
We're also lecturing in different places, not only just Portugal, Spain, Germany, and so on. Our chapter of Emerging Leaders in India will be lecturing locally as well.
Very good.
So that's all very exciting. So education through contact with schools and universities is one thing to increase the awareness of trade finance, to make sure that
100%, you need that.
Absolutely, and to make sure, I'm living proof, because I didn't want to come into trade finance because of the negative image that I had caused by or created by that lecture.
Your lectures, exactly. So you're doing exactly the antithesis of what your lectures were doing.
Absolutely.
Because it is exciting. You're dealing with some very international issues, very relevant issues, and things that really matter for the world economy and world peace. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it does matter, because
100%.
when countries don't trade with each other, they have no real connection, which leaves animosity and things to derive out of that.
Look
Countries
at
trade together, stay together.
Absolutely, and look at what's happening now on the back of protectionism and so on.
We're going to get into the protectionism. It's going to be a big
people are just talking tough now. And if you don't get trade to lower these barriers, then it becomes very, very difficult.
So then what happens, for example, because you mentioned you wanted to talk about the trade finance gap.
Yes.
Is $1.5 trillion gap in what needs to be financed and what is financed. And typically from what I know about it, and I'm sure you're going to educate us about it as well, one of the main reasons as to why that is because there's a lack of AML and KYC regulations for banks to be confident that they won't get fined or they have all the paperwork in place. Typically, this happens in countries or in continents like Africa, where their AML, KYC capability and their standards aren't as succinct or aren't as synced to Western markets. How does that play out in reality? So if I can't finance an SME, and SMEs are the biggest groups of kinds of companies that don't get financing, what happens as a result of that? Can you go through the process of what that means?
Absolutely. So,
and give us some examples perhaps of projects that you could have worked on, but because of certain reasons you couldn't.
Look, for me, the examples are less so, and you'll understand from my answer, because I look, what you said is the script in terms of what, for example, is in the Asian Development Bank, they do a tremendous survey every year. I have it here. And they say, if you ask the bankers, what do they say the main obstacles are? And I know those figures because I've included them in my lectures as well. So number one is undoubtedly compliance. But listen, I mean, when you work for a bank, and this is very controversial, some people don't like me saying this, but when you work for a bank, compliance becomes a bit of an excuse. So, for example, Crown Agents Bank, I mean, we don't shy away from compliance. We take compliance to the well, it's our raison d'être, our reason for living. But we make it a competitive advantage for us because we're so good at compliance that we're actually setting the trend. And educating is probably a bit of a strong word, but enabling banks and, mostly banks in places like Africa and Asia and the Caribbean and so on and so forth, and parts of Latin America, to become good at this compliance thing. So we're often engaged by supranationals like the IMF and the World Bank, and then cascading down to central banks and so on, to work with the commercial banks in these places to make them good in terms of compliance and raising the standards. I mean, I'll never forget when people tell me that compliance is an issue. Okay, compliance may be an issue, but it's more of a cost issue if we're truly honest. I mean, it is how much you're going to invest as an institution in onboarding another institution in a small country that is not going to yield enough for you to cover your human costs and your infrastructure costs and so on and so forth. So that becomes a massive issue. But it's a cost issue. It's not really a matter of how dangerous these places are. Of course, there is an element of that because then you allocate resources in accordance with your perceived risk. But answer me this: if it was a matter of engagement from the local counterparties, because as everybody says, they're all so bad and so risky, how do you explain that a bank in Sierra Leone, for example, when we went in and did our due diligence and we told them what they needed to do in order to become kind of world-class from a compliance AML AFC point of view, they go out and they hire 100 temporary staff to make good their account opening forms with their clients in a space of 3 months.
Do you want to answer that? I think part of it is the fact that you guys as Crown agents have an experience in working in emerging markets, so you know their sense of their tempo and how they respond to your requests. Banks who typically work in more established markets may not even want to get involved because they think it's too sticky, it's too messy. We're not even going to make a lot of money since it's an SME.
It's the money issue. It's the money issue.
It's an SME, so how much can we really flip it for? Not too much. Let's stick to what we know, and that gap will grow. But if it doesn't affect us, then it's not our responsibility to go everywhere. No. It's to go to where we feel comfortable. If we don't feel comfortable, that's where you guys pick up the slack, and that's where you guys can become real leaders in this and helping those institutions.
And if you think about it, it's a matter of scaling as well. So if you're financing an SME for, I don't know, $500,000, I would dare saying that the effort invested and the manpower invested would be as large as a $10 million facility for a trader somewhere. And of course the legal costs and so on make it somewhat ineffective. So that is also one of the origins of the trade finance gap. But the interesting part, if you look at the assessment by the Asian Development Bank, is that the biggest slices are around creditworthiness of the borrowers, and also structuring ability. And I normally tend to collapse both of them, because you can look at, or you can mitigate the creditworthiness or lack of it through structuring. So why did those, your first question about my career and my path and so on, and trade finance gap, how do they fit so well together? And that's kind of the cherry on top of the cake here, is because it's all education driven, right? If you don't understand what you're doing, if you don't understand how to take security, for example, in a trade finance transaction in an emerging market, and eventually how you can create economies of scale around taking security for different borrowers, SME borrowers, for example, you'll never be able to cover the trade finance gap. If it was just a matter of compliance, then we all shy away and the gap will only tend to increase. If we're serious about, I normally say something that, again, is very controversial, and I apologize. I don't want to offend anyone, but as many people, bankers tend to be somewhat reluctant to go the extra mile. Yeah. Right.
They're conservative as a profession. They want to mitigate risk as much as possible. So why go into an area where we don't know?
You don't go the extra mile. You're afraid of the unknown. You're anxious. You're this and you're that, and you're fearful.
Also, compliance costs are a lot, and being fined by some of the FCA or the SEC is
it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant. But the thing is, if you do it properly, you don't get fined. If you do it properly, you don't get fined. If you do your security as well properly, you mitigate the creditworthiness and you mitigate your structures and collateral and this and that. But the most important thing is to go from A to Z in the value chain, right? Understand your cash flow gaps, understand how to extract security from the client's operational cycle, and eventually what security really works. So have a good lawyer at all times. Then people talk a lot about fintech
as a solution.
As a solution, I think. No, people see fintech as the holy grail, right? Yeah. I don't see fintech as the holy grail. Yeah. I see fintech as being part of the conversation. Yeah. So, it's the same as the rise of the internet, right? So before the internet, we were all kind of sending funny messages to each other and dialing up telephone calls and so on and so forth on the fixed lines. After the internet, the world became a lot more democratic. But the internet is just a channel. The internet revolutionized the way we exchange information, but it's just a channel. It didn't, in some aspects, it facilitated a revolution in terms of content, but the content was one way or another always there. So fintech to me is the same. Unless you address the fundamental issues like compliance, like creditworthiness, like structuring, and so on and so forth in the trade finance world, just because you're using a slicker channel, it doesn't mean that you're going to decrease the trade finance gap. And I think this is absolutely critical. If you use technology and fintechs as an enabler of better solutions around compliance, creditworthiness, structuring, and so on and so forth, due diligence led, then of course you make them a lot lighter from a cost point of view. And that's where blockchain and the likes will probably kick in and help a lot.
But don't you think that's where the excuses come in as well? Because people would then will say, we don't understand how this fintech works. So by the time we adopt this, a new fintech will come out, and that's, their core reasons, they don't really express too much, perhaps because they don't want to, which are going into uncertain markets. It's gonna put a hole in our profits. If we get fined, we don't understand it. The profits aren't there. These are the real reasons. Yes. And the excuses or the reasons they give are compliance, fintech, maybe not understanding the market as well. Yes. As you said, the defaults on the services they provide. All of these things become reasons as to what it is, but the core is something else.
Definitely.
Is perhaps because you've worked in these markets in the past, you understand a lot more, and you work better with bankers and organizations who have that life experience working in these frontier and emerging markets. That's why you as a person and Crown Agents as an organization are much more efficient.
It is about that level of knowledge. Make no mistake. You can't create a shortcut.
But it seems strange to me though, Duarte, because trade finance is so global in its nature. surely you need to have a global mindset, a global knowledge of how things work for you to be profitable and also enjoy the work you do. So then how do you marry up the reasons as to we don't understand it, but you are a trade finance is the oldest kind of
remember, so
game.
it depends on
business.
the organization or organizations you work with or you work for. I know organizations where as a trade finance employee, you're basically just doing a very, very small part of the chain. So like, for example, you're selling...
You're pigeonholed.
That's it. You're selling letters of credit and guarantees to clients in the northeast of England in a given industry, right? So how restrictive is that? Again, going back to my career, if you look at my career, I've been in the right place at the right time. I've been very lucky, but I've done pretty much everything except managing a fund, although I've been challenged to do that already, and perhaps working for a commodity trading company, although I do work a lot with them, so I know how they work. I haven't been pigeonholed. So the whole thing I do for the ITFA, for example, is with the mentoring schemes, with the awards, with the educational seminars, etc., is to make sure that our emerging leaders have that broader knowledge of trade rather than being pigeonholed into one or two products and eventually making that their life until there's some sort of promotion and they get to go to a different part of the bank and eventually they don't get to enjoy trade finance for the exciting thing it really is.
Yeah. It's really good you say that, because I've been exposed to the young professionals community. I'm part of it as well. And you meet some really interesting characters. Puya, for example, is a good friend of mine. I've known him since before, and I'm sure he's gonna, enjoy having his name mentioned. He's really good. He's an
amazing guy.
He's a very active character as well, and I find
one of my first mentees.
Yeah, I mean, you find these kinds of people. Because I've been involved in some other young professional things in the past, but it seemed like the people who went there, really all they want to do is kind of suck up to the bosses and just have their face shown, But in this community, when I go to the events, they take their responsibilities in this program very seriously, and they actually create. They create the website. They create. You guys were involved in those TV interviews as well with the
Deutsche Bank
TV.
Yeah.
So you're out there, and they're hungry to learn about it. Perhaps because it is so international, and they have the mentorship of you and your colleagues to tell them that it's not just you're not pigeonholed into this one thing, but this one thing is related to such a big array of work you can do. Keep your mind open in the macro, but work in the micro.
Yeah. One thing I learned from these guys is that, they can do anything they want. They've got a different level of motivation.
Is the difference from your generation?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Well, how so? What were your generation thinking about, and what are we thinking about, do you think?
I don't know. My generation, there's not so much of a gap, but I'll probably look into the generation before mine.
Yeah. The baby boomers.
Yeah. It's probably less ambitious, more conformist. Life is the way it is. Just suck up and live it. Your generation is a lot more, what can I do for myself? Really to, develop myself as a professional. But not only that, going back to what we were discussing at the beginning, to have a great life. And that's what makes the difference. That's what, that's the difference between, I have to go to a seminar because they serve a really, really great bacon roll, or going to a seminar because I'm going to meet XYZ person who's going to share, possibly not even about trade finance, but who's going to share about something that's going on. That's it. Something that's going on in their lives, and that's making them excited.
Well, that's the reason why I come to the events. I'm involved in trade finance in this association, and also in the work that I want to do. As you know very well, sort of understanding geopolitical risk and globalization and technology. These things matter so much to trade. And it's so vital for the industry to understand. So I approach it from that point of view. But everyone who I've met is very active, and I like that. And I think you need to cultivate that mentality young. It's easier to mold the minds when they're young as opposed to change it when they're old and they're stuck in their ways. I
go no further. I've got one of the best people I've ever worked with. He's not even 23 yet. Nigel Atamensa, who together with Charlotte Pryor and Alero Ruby, won this year's Emerging Trade Financier of the Year award, or last year, sorry, so 2019. Nigel, I've started working with him about 18 months to 2 years ago, and I can tell you the guy's 23 and he's already one of the leaders on the floor out there. He's just completely unstoppable at the age of 23. It's unbelievable. Of course, he's a Jim, and I don't want, or I can't think that everybody is a Nigel, as we say it out there in the floor. But he does set a very, very high standard. How would I define him? Is hunger for knowledge, or hungry for knowledge. He is very humble, very determined, but he's got an incredible strategic mindset, and he knows what he wants. I think that last part is very important.
Knowing what you want,
He knows what he wants.
You need to have self-awareness though for that. You need to know who you are and
Definitely.
what you can achieve, and then go for it.
You know what his first year at Crown Agents Bank looked like?
What?
It was basically grabbing his laptop, going into conference calls and meetings and writing notes. And most people I know of his age would think that, like me when I started, I'm a hedge fund trader, look at me, so important. Nigel couldn't care less. So that trait of being humble and hungry for knowledge is absolutely critical. And then eventually, when he felt he could bloom or blossom, he's been just on an upward scale, and we're all running bets around here for when he will be the boss of all of us, and we the agreement is that it won't take too long, but it really defines. Nigel is an active member of the Emerging Leaders Committee, but it really defines how I think your generation is a lot more driven than the previous generations. I think
that's good. Well, what do you think, Kapusin? Yeah, we have a Kapusin is helping us. She's at UCL. She's studying Eastern Europe studies.
Wow.
And I mean, I was at university about 5 years ago. It seems so long ago, even now when I think about it. But I think students now, or young people now, have the education. But it's really up to the person themselves to determine what their life looks like, and having the confidence to do that. I mean, the stresses that my parents had when they first came to the UK, for example, were completely different to what mine are.
Absolutely.
But I think that my stresses are for my day.
Yes.
Yours were for your day.
Yes.
And my dad always says, "Oh, well, what I had to go through coming here, you guys will have experienced 0.5% of it. What do you have to complain about?"
Yes.
But we face different things, which are good and bad.
Exactly.
But it's the way you think about the struggles.
The scale is what you make.
Yeah.
Right. So my struggles, your struggles, I mean, and your fathers and my fathers and so on and so forth. It's all about what you make, where you are in life, right? So all of a sudden, life takes a different direction, and it's about how you're going to embrace it.
It's very true.
I tend to see things as opportunities, to be honest with you. Again, it's not always like that. Sometimes life seems really grey and miserable, but I tend to give myself a good kick in the backside.
But even if it is grey and miserable, you have to go through that period. Know that that's how I feel. I'm going to go through it and then come out the other. Don't determine your whole life is going to be that way only because you're going through that stage.
Mourning period is absolutely critical. I would say that, when I hit rock bottom, those were probably the critical moments of my life. Don't get me wrong, and I've mentioned this at the beginning, going from being a hedge fund trader to being an operations clerk,
very different mindset.
Which was my title back then. Can you imagine? Operations clerk, which is a lovely title to have, but from a guy who was a futures trader before, and who ambitioned this wonderful career in capital markets, and who had been given this lecture on how horrible trade finance was. Didn't really resonate. So of course, it was a down moment, but what happened? I had two choices. One, I would just let myself go. Two, I would pick myself up and eventually make something out of it. And that's what happened.
I had the tiger.
Absolutely.
That's good. We're going into this, probably veering into a different aspect. We touched on it earlier, and it's something that we hear a lot about in the world of trade. And it's related to what's happening. Now, I think two things I'm going to jump into. One is protectionism, and one is something that I would love to take your point of view on, and is how is the China-US trade war actually affecting trade volumes and how it's happening, how it's affecting on the ground? Is there a lag in seeing the effects, or is it very instantaneous? Let's start on the protectionism side of it. The world is becoming more protectionist, as we can see. In preparation for this podcast, I researched, it was online, a UK law firm, Gowling WLG, in 2017, November, published a study on this. And this is pretty obvious stuff, but they put the numbers to it. They said since 2009, the world has implemented more than 7,000 measures believed to be injurious to global trade. The US has passed up 1,300 pieces of legislation way before Trump came into office even. But the biggest sort of proponents of protectionism were Argentina and India.
Interesting.
With Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, bucking the trend by being the most open, most porous in terms of their, and certainly Saudi Arabia need to innovate because they can't rely on oil for the rest of their lives. You see the IPO of Saudi Aramco to get the cash in to develop, right?
Yes.
But from your experience, how has protectionism affected your line of work?
Listen,
and how would you define that?
Protectionism is there, and it's undoubted. And to me, it's a much bigger conversation, right? So we need to look into history, and that's why I get very concerned with the current times, and not just within trade finance or even banking. I remember when the Lehman Brothers crisis happened, I started reading a book about the Great Depression and everything that happened following the Great Depression. And if you think about it, we may be going in repeat mode.
In a cycle.
As we speak, yes. Yeah. And that's the concerning part, because we all know that the Great Depression ended up in people beating themselves up badly in the Second World War. But if you look at it, it was a big financial crisis. And what's the tendency you have in when things go wrong? I'm not talking about you, Klisman, or me, but I'm talking about...
As a society.
Yeah, society. We tend to point fingers out, right? It's not my fault. It's that guy stealing my job.
You start to act out.
So it's and then you have right wing or extreme left wing coming into power, and it polarizes society, right? So society starts living on the back of fear rather than possibility. So, like him or not, I'm not a big fan, to be honest, but you have the rise of Donald Trump in the US. But it's not so much the figurehead Donald Trump.
It's a movement behind him.
Exactly. Hope it doesn't listen to the podcast, because otherwise we're doomed. We're going to be on his Twitter feed, etc., etc. But it's an interesting movement, which is fed by fear. Then you have Brexit, with its merits and weak points, but the impact it had was direct impact was to increase anxiety against foreigners and just creating scapegoatism and so on and so forth, and creating isolationism, and so on and so forth. And you look at the rise of nearly racist movements across continental Europe. It goes around and round and round.
But in terms of trade, I think from what I've seen, the only two active responses of this right wing or this extreme movement has been sort of what Trump is doing with China and also Brexit. I mean, there's been a rise of the far right throughout Europe, but I haven't seen any actionable, trade policies from these guys.
I think we need to look outside the US and Europe and Britain and China and so on and so forth, because the biggest lesson at the minute is coming from Africa. Africa, led by His Excellency President Paul Kagame from Rwanda, and a very, very, very good new generation of politicians across the continent, still with the notable exceptions, but the overwhelmingly much, much better than it was in the past. And under the leadership of Paul Kagame and the African Union, they are now establishing the Intra-Africa Free Trade Agreement, of which I believe nearly 100% of African states have signed up for. And of course, they're in the process of ratifying and so on. And if memory doesn't fail me, from July onwards, this largest free trade area since the creation of WTO is coming into force on the back of policies that are completely contrarian to what the United States and the UK to a certain extent and continental Europe and so on are undertaking through that polarization. Africa is finally coming together, and I do believe that this creates massive opportunities. Your second question, if I recall correctly, was on whether this has a lag effect.
This protectionism, does it affect trade straight away, or what are the resulting trade implications specifically?
Listen, I'll be very honest with you. I'm very emerging markets focused, right? So I can give you the emerging markets outlook. And remember Belt and Road.
Yeah.
So that dominates, right? So that's outside. It's not outside the sphere of influence of the United States or Europe, but the Chinese were, as they normally are, extremely intelligent in the way that they reignited their trade routes, or they're on the verge of reigniting their trade routes, very much outside of their geographical boundaries and restrictions. And that was just genius, because how did they do it? China developed for many years on the back of internal consumption, and of course creating a market for their exports. But very quickly they realized that for them to continue moving the machine, they needed, number one, commodities that were very scarce for them and that were abundant in places like Africa. But they needed to keep their companies, especially state-owned companies, going. So it's very simple. The boats were going into Africa to pick up the commodities, and they thought, well, what the heck? I mean, these guys need to be brought up in their development stage. So why don't we offer our companies our financing to make that happen? And eventually, the Belt and Road was born, and they are now not only significantly expanding their area of influence, but they're also profiting a lot in terms of how it's executed. Quite a few states, if not all of them, in Africa have contracted Chinese yuan denominated debt with China from Chinese banks and from the Chinese state, that is then used to pay Chinese companies to go and develop projects in infrastructure projects in these places, which will then benefit Chinese exports tremendously. Right. So it's genius. I mean, of course, Trump is uneasy with the whole thing, and we mustn't forget geography here, because war and peace is all about geographical expansion and contraction. And what is happening in effect is a geographical expansion from China. So of course Mr. Trump and his administration, and even if it wasn't Mr. Trump, someone else would be uneasy with this whole thing, because it creates a threat to America's dominance in world trade.
You see also that the BNI, Belt and Road Initiative, was announced, I think, 2009, right after the crash of the West. So I think that was strategic, opportunistic, but very sensible of them to go into it when the world in the West was burning.
Yes.
So they came with an alternative view of what your life could look like, or what your trade routes can look like if you work with us. And they can play the long game. They don't have, the political structures we have that pivot every 4 to 5 years.
Quite right.
And especially when we have a president that comes in who has such forceful views, it pivots to a very high degree. And then the rest of the world needs to either catch up, align, or now we see a disalignment in Europe, and that leaves the UK being independent from EU now, needing to form their own response to this.
Exactly.
Because the EU have been consistent all along. Perhaps they've been conservative. They haven't really spoken out too much in terms of foreign policy or their trade, because it's worked for them to an extent. You can debate that.
They've got too many consensus to forge.
27,
That's it, to become influential. I mean, we're doing a little bit of lobbying work now within the ITFA in terms of the capital rules and the insurance product. And we're learning a lot about how the European Union works in terms of their own decision making. And it's a very, very interesting machine in terms of generating consensus or even majorities. It's difficult to see. Although the European Union has so much potential, it's difficult to see how it can materialize that potential on the back of the red tape that it fosters sometimes.
I find that now, only a few days ago, Macron allowed the accession talks of Albania and Macedonia to begin, because he blocked it a few months ago. And he said, even, it's hard enough having 27 members now to agree on things. Imagine having 30 or 32.
Yes.
These smaller Balkan players are going to be there they're not going to contribute much, I don't think.
Yes.
Their markets aren't that big for any major EU player to really care about. They want it for their own benefit. But they are sort of needing the EU to cooperate with them without offering anything substantial back to them. So It's always going to be like a donor system where the big boys and girls, I guess France and Germany, that play the biggest role, need to coordinate, their responses to all these things happening as the two biggest players, and the rest of them, middling players and fledgling players, need to either agree, or if they don't agree, you see things like what's happening in Hungary, what's happening in Italy, voicing their in Poland, what's happening there with the right wing party there. Yes. Showing their disagreement. They was very well aligned in the past when there was only about 13. But as you grow and grow, you need to coordinate this. Yes. It's hard enough for you and I to agree on something. Yes. Where can we go for dinner? Something that is that has a fight, has an end game, right?
I'm a big believer. I'm a big believer in democracy, but someone needs to be there to make the tough calls. Huh?
Yeah, and then you have institutions like the EU Commission, which many people who believe in democracy, which I'm sure is the most of the West, but when it comes time to them dictating policy, you try to have a balance in that sense, but they haven't gotten it perfect. Yeah. That's where you see the discontentment happening.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what you see happening, and it's very interesting from my point of view when I see the Balkan nations wanting to have accession because they think that's going to be the key to their liberation. But I say a joke, and the population of Albania now is 2.8 million. The second they become part of the EU, it probably drop to one person. They have to turn off the lights until after they leave, hopefully, they get their act together themselves in developing infrastructure. But it's a very interesting time in the world. But going back to the point of, I found it interesting when you spoke about China's influence in Africa. Can you give us some more from your experience? How have their influence there? How has it been taken? And also another point before actually we go into that. I find many, even when I sometimes speak on television or I speak to people, people consider Africa a homogeneous, continent, but they forget that it's 54 nations.
It's anything
with their own ambition, with their own agenda.
No. But the problem is
their own leaderships.
But I would even question whether there are 54 nations.
Yeah, there you go as well.
I mean, the nations were imposed by the colonizing powers,
right.
and many times, and you had. So many civil war situations in Africa precisely because someone came in and drew a boundary where there were two tribes that didn't really get along, and trying to get them both on the same space is very challenging. Right. So
do you think it's helpful speaking about Africa as a because obviously Africa as a continent is well to be
so
said,
diverse.
There's so many things happening in that continent.
So you can't.
You can never speak of Europe as one thing either. You can't speak of anything as one thing.
Exactly. But mistake number one in Africa is to consider that everything's the same. Yeah. I mean, crikey. I mean, go to Sierra Leone or Liberia, and then go down to Angola or DRC or Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, or
any of these
Nairobi,
places,
or Kigali. Kigali is a different place altogether, right?
Different beast
in Rwanda. But you're asking how the Chinese influence demonstrates itself in Africa.
How has it been taken?
And how has it been taken? So
I think that's probably really broad itself as a question. But can you?
No. But it's very interesting. Let me give you my Angolan experience. Okay. Right. So. Every third or fourth vehicle you see on the road is Chinese, especially the trucks. They're all yellow and red and orange and so on. Sino truck,
Sino colors.
Yes, the so-called taxis, African taxis, which used to be Toyota Hiace, are now Chinese versions of that. The Chinese build cities within cities and infrastructure and whatever, and they bring their own workforce, right?
Yeah,
it's huge. So the road signs are, so for example, in Angola, they're both in Chinese and in Portuguese.
Okay.
And then you have a very, very interesting phenomena as well, which is, of course, Chinese population moving there and establishing themselves there, you start having a mix between Chinese and the local population. So you have Chinese kid with African roots. And also the other phenomena is the spin-off. So the Chinese tend to go into these countries as part of state-owned enterprises, and then they find out their own business niches, and they set off on themselves by, I don't know, importing foodstuffs to service the Chinese communities, and eventually they create an entrepreneurial community of their own. So it's huge. Just to give an idea, when I was in Angola, and Angola and the rest of Africa, to be honest, I participated in so many meetings where I was so kindly welcomed and hosted by my Chinese counterparts that I felt uneasy by not being able to speak Mandarin. So I started learning. I've got about when did I start learning? It's about 7 years now of Mandarin speaking. Don't test me because
I can't speak of myself
because it's still terrible. But but I felt the urge and the need to get to know the language. It is dominant. It can't be avoided anymore.
And on the ground roots, the actual people, the day-to-day people who live, who don't work in your field, how have they taken the influence of China physically being there, cooperating
it's
and sometimes not cooperating?
It's the usual. So, they're treated as, unfortunately, it happens in Europe as well with citizens from one part of Europe migrating to another part of Europe, being considered second-class citizens, being discriminated and so on. When you have an invasion, quote unquote, of people from a different culture or different part of the world, they tend to become scapegoats. So anything that goes wrong is their fault, right? But it's normal. People will. I think people in the world, and again going back to the generational gaps, people from these newer generations are much more citizens of the world. And again, thank you, internet, for that. And they can understand a lot better and integrate new cultures. Unless you live in the center of the United States and life is a big Trump rally, but I guess you need to take that with a pinch of salt.
That's right. Because you travel quite often to Africa.
I do, yeah.
To different countries, to different cities. You're there sometimes when I email you or when I call you, either goes to voicemail, I'm not here, or in your email signature, I'm off globetrotting in Africa again. Okay, he's off again. If someone were to on a more cultural side, if they were to visit, if they haven't been, to the continent before, or perhaps if they've been to the most generic places, if they've been to sort of holiday spots, and sort of even in Egypt or places like this, where would you think would be a good place for them to experience how it's developing, and the side of Africa where we don't perhaps
Rwanda, undoubtedly.
Because you've got your charity there, obviously,
yes,
and you're doing a lot of good work with them. So.
But I'm privileged because under President Kagame, or President Kagame, as we call it in Kinyarwanda, we have the foresight of his leadership, and the creation of infrastructure. Do you know that, for example, there is at least one company manufacturing laptops in Rwanda?
No.
Do you know that there is a company, very good company, Mara Phones, manufacturing phones in Rwanda, smartphones? It's incredible, absolutely incredible. There are motorcycles being built in Rwanda. There will be a car assembling plant in Rwanda. It's unbelievable. Do you know that Rwanda is the country in the world, I believe, so if I'm quoting incorrectly, I beg forgiveness, but if it's not the country in the world, it's one of the, with the largest women representation in public office.
Okay.
It's unbelievable.
That's very good.
The whole country is managed as a big corporate. The president sets KPIs. He then brings all his top ministers and so on an offsite. He then gives them their KPIs, and then KPIs are cascaded throughout the entire infrastructure.
From the top down.
Correct. Everybody's got KPIs. Everybody.
Okay.
And they live and die by those KPIs.
That's very good.
And sometimes it's like, how do you call it? That TV show where the guy would say, "You're fired."
Apprentice.
The Apprentice, exactly.
With Donald Trump as well.
Well, yes. Although President Kagame is a much nicer and better leader, at least in my eyes.
Oh, very good. And is there anything else that you want the people listening to this or the audience to know about the charity work you're doing? And if they want to help contribute in whatever way, how would they be able to do that?
Very good. Thank you for the opportunity. Look, the charity in itself works a little bit like SOS Villages, but without the same infrastructure.
Okay.
We take children off the streets. So in Rwanda,
what's the name of the charity? Just so
Shelter Them.
Shelter Them.
So
www.shelterthem.com.
Correct.
Okay.
And through the website, you can contribute, you can sponsor children, you can contribute to different projects and so on.
Yeah.
The way it works is we take kids off the streets, normally with single mothers who live in extreme poverty. And we give them ceiling, so we give them a home, we give them food, we give them health insurance, and eventually, most importantly, we give them education.
Okay.
So last year we opened a kindergarten, and I was very privileged because I was heavily involved in the creation of that kindergarten. So as you may imagine, a banker turned
philanthropist.
A philanthropist or more, just focused on education. I had to go out and buy all the toys myself.
Wow.
I had to hire the teacher myself with the staff on the ground, my country manager Jules and the rest of the team. We designed the entire kindergarten ourselves. We ordered all the equipment ourselves. We designed the curriculum ourselves. It was very interesting.
A lot of heavy lifting.
Very heavy lifting. So education is absolutely critical. So we have 20 to 30 children now in Kigali, and this we call it Early Childhood Development Center. And these children didn't even, they've learned how to read, believe it or not, in the space of 9 months now. They get 3 meals a day. Everything is super professional as such. Only about 10% of children in Rwanda, and make no mistake, it's Rwanda, so one of the most advanced countries in Africa, only 10% of the children attend early childhood education. What we do then is when they move on to the 6+, so primary, we organize study focus groups for them, and we've got kids that have gone all the way to university now.
Very good.
We've got 2 main sites. One is Kigali, so the capital, and then we're supporting a community in a different district called or province called Bugesera, in a community called Gateko, where we have a piece of land. And we're building, so our biggest dream is to build a vocational school there.
Okay.
But it comes with a huge price tag, so we're taking baby steps.
Are you looking to fundraise now as well?
Definitely, yeah. So Crown Agents Bank, for example, has been a kind partner. And we've got a huge community in Canada, interestingly Portuguese community as well in Canada, and we've got a brilliant community in Newfoundland, of all places. One of the families, the Lanes, have very generously contributed this year for the construction of our community center in Gateko, where we'll house another early childhood development center with capacity up to 70 kids.
So how many kids do you work with now?
In total, 170. Well, 168 was the total as of 31st of December last year.
Very good.
So it's very exciting.
Sounds like it.
It takes takes a bit of my time.
Yeah.
It's also opened immense opportunities.
It's an excuse to go and see how you're helping their lives as well.
Listen,
and seeing and traveling not only for business but also to give back.
So every time I go to that part of the world, of course I stop in Rwanda. I've got. She's not my daughter, but I call her my daughter, Sandrine. She's the same age as Alice, my biological daughter. Yeah. And Sandrine is now going to the international school in Kigali, and being given all the opportunity to develop herself to her full potential. And of course, every time I can, I'll go there, and we're heavily involved and engaged in making sure that the kids are well looked after.
Good. And if people want to get into contact with you, Duarte, specifically, if they have any questions about trade finance, or if they're young professionals, what routes would they go about to find you?
Listen, I'm an open book. Duarte.Pedreira at crownagentsbank.com. Or if you want I'm on LinkedIn, absolutely.
Yeah. We'll put a link to your LinkedIn
definitely,
on the podcast.
And or my personal email as well at gmail.com. So duarte.pedreira@gmail.com.
Beautiful.
Completely open book.
Very good.
If people want to interact, engage, feel free.
What if they want to practice martial arts with you? Because I know you're going there. They can challenge you to a fight.
I'm a very, very peaceful guy. Whenever
Very
I got I practice Shotokan karate.
You're a black belt now, no?
Yes. I've been doing it for over 25 years.
Wow.
And it's one of my biggest passions. If my sensei Ote is listening to this, he won't be very happy because I haven't been to the dojo for 6 months.
Oh, no.
And but I fully intend to go back. I'm just trying to convince my girlfriend to come with me.
That's very good.
But eventually I will go back and enjoy the lights of karate again.
Is there anything else that you want to mention in terms of your projects or anything that you want to?
No, I think we covered a lot.
Covered some really good topics.
Yeah, I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity.
I'm going to interview Andre also about the
really.
Context. So I'm going to interview him and some others lined up. So
excellent.
Great. I guess we'll finish it here. Thank you so much, Duarte.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Easy.
Appreciate it.